Well, it's good to be staying busy. Great film based on real events, but this is quite different.
At 80, Ron Howard finally did what no one thought he ever would. The man Hollywood has long called its kindest soul calm, humble, endlessly polite, confessed that for more than half a century, he had carried 6 names he could never forgive. 6 faces that haunted him quietly. On set, off set, and in the silent spaces between his triumphs. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply smiled a tired, wounded smile and said, "Sometimes you don't hate people because they're bad. You hate them because they show you the weakest part of yourself." From Tom Hanks to Russell Crowe, from Jim Carrey to Hugh Laurie, names the world thought he adored, each one hides a fracture, a silent bruise beneath decades of applause. For the first time, Ron Howard opens the vault of his disappointments, the betrayals that shaped his gentle silence, and the grudges that never healed. And as these 6 stories unfold, one truth becomes clear: even the kindest man in Hollywood has shadows he never dared to face until now. Tom Hanks, the friend who outshined him. They met in the early 80s. 2 men chasing light in the same city of illusions. Ron Howard had just stepped behind the camera after years of being the red-haired boy America grew up with. Tom Hanks was still unknown, nervous, funny, full of the kind of restless charm that could turn an ordinary scene into gold. When Ron cast him in Splash 1984, it wasn't just a director choosing an actor, it was the birth of what many called Hollywood's safest friendship. For years, they looked like brothers, one behind the camera, one in front, both feeding off each other's warmth. Ron admired Tom's spontaneity, his instinctive humor, the way he made everything look effortless. But as Hank's fame exploded, something subtle shifted. Every movie they made together, Splash, Apollo 13, The Da Vinci Code, seemed to belong less to Ron and more to Tom. The press began calling them Hanks films, quietly erasing the man who built the frame. Ron never said a word. He smiled at the red carpets, clapped during award speeches, and gave the same line in every interview: "Tom brings out the best in everyone." But privately, those words became a kind of armor, a way to hide the sting of being overshadowed by the actor he had once discovered. He saw Hanks become the emblem of decency, the public's perfect man. And behind that halo, Ron's quiet craftsmanship disappeared into the background. The real fracture came during Apollo 13. The movie was meant to be Ron's great leap, a technical, emotional, and visual achievement that would reintroduce him as a serious director. But once again, all headlines revolved around Tom's heroic transformation. When the film was nominated for Best Picture, journalists framed it as Tom Hanks in another Ron Howard masterpiece, as if the man behind the lens were only a supporting act. Friends noticed a change. Ron stopped calling Tom as often. When they did meet, their conversations drifted toward nostalgia rather than creation. The comfort between them began to thin, replaced by polite distance. On set, Ron grew quieter. He directed with precision, but no longer with warmth. "I realized," he later said, "that sometimes admiration turns into invisibility." Tom, of course, never sensed the depth of that wound. He continued speaking fondly of Ron, even calling him one of my favorite humans in interviews. But to Ron, that phrase began to sound like a pat on the head, not a gesture of equals. He didn't hate Hanks as a person, he hated the dynamic that fame created between them, one man shining so brightly that the other's light disappeared. When asked years later if he would ever direct Tom again, Ron smiled that familiar modest smile and said, "Maybe. But I think our stories belong to different skies now." It was a gentle way of closing a door that had long been half open. And perhaps that's what hurt most, that the friend who made his career also became the mirror of everything he'd never be, effortlessly beloved, eternally visible. They never argued. They never reconciled. They simply drifted apart. Two men bound by gratitude, separated by success. Russell Crowe, the ego that collided. By the time Ron Howard cast Russell Crowe in Cinderella Man 2005, he already knew the stories. Everyone in Hollywood did. Crowe was brilliant, unpredictable, volcanic, the kind of actor who could destroy a scene or make it immortal. Ron, the calm craftsman, believed he could channel that fire. What he didn't know was how close that fire would come to burning him too. The tension began on day one. Crowe questioned everything, the lighting, the blocking, even the rhythm of dialogue. "You hired me for my instincts," he told Ron. "Let me use them." Ron nodded, trying to keep peace, but inside he could feel the balance slipping. He wasn't used to losing control on his own set. The clashes grew quiet but sharp. Crowe would arrive late, rewrite lines, or storm out when Ron asked for another take. Crew members learned to read the weather in Ron's eyes, the stillness before a storm he refused to show. To the public, everything seemed perfect, another Howard Crowe reunion after A Beautiful Mind. But behind the camera, it was a duel between two visions, one of structure, one of chaos. Ron admired Crowe's intensity until it became tyranny. During one argument about a key scene, Crowe threw his script across the room. "You want me to play a hero?" he snapped. "But you're scared of the anger that makes him real." Ron didn't answer. He just said, softly, "I am not scared of your anger. I am scared of losing the film." Those words ended the conversation, but not the silence that followed. For weeks, the energy on set was thick, almost electric. Crowe delivered a performance that was raw, powerful, unforgettable, but every take felt like a small act of war. Ron later admitted that directing Crowe was like trying to sculpt a hurricane. When the film premiered, critics praised Crowe's performance as one of his best. Almost no one mentioned Ron's direction. Interviews focused on Crowe's intensity, his method discipline, the same behaviors that had drained everyone around him. Ron smiled through the press tour, but his eyes carried the fatigue of someone who had spent months trying to hold an empire together with silence. In private, he told a friend, "Russell doesn't just fill the screen, he consumes it. And maybe that's why he's great. But it leaves nothing for anyone else." It wasn't jealousy. It was exhaustion, the realization that kindness and patience had limits, even for a man like him. When Cinderella Man failed to meet box office expectations, Crowe blamed Universal's marketing. Ron said nothing. For him, the failure wasn't in numbers, but in the loss of trust, the quiet understanding that he could no longer direct someone who refused to be directed. Years later, when asked about Crowe, Ron's words were carefully chosen. "Russell is one of the most gifted actors I've ever worked with. He gives everything. Maybe too much." They never reunited. The film remained a testament to both their brilliance and their inability to coexist. It wasn't hatred born from betrayal. It was the exhaustion of trying to control what was never meant to be controlled. In Hollywood, some storms pass. Others leave permanent weather. For Ron Howard, Russell Crowe was the storm that never truly cleared. Jim Carrey, the chaos he couldn't control. When Ron Howard agreed to direct How the Grinch Stole Christmas in 2000, he thought he was making a whimsical family movie. What he found instead was a test of endurance, not of skill. but of sanity. The cause of that test was Jim Carrey. Carrey was at the height of his power, adored by audiences, trusted by studios, and feared by anyone who had to manage his boundless energy. On paper, his casting as the Grinch was perfect, manic, elastic, unpredictable. In practice, it was war. From the first week of shooting, chaos reigned. Carrey refused to stay still for costume fittings, disappeared between takes, and improvised entire scenes that sent continuity spiraling out of control. He would switch from genius to tantrum in seconds. "I am the Grinch," he shouted once. "You can't direct the Grinch, you survive him." Ron Howard tried patience, reason, humor. Nothing worked for long. The makeup process alone, nearly 3 hours a day, turned Carrey into a ticking bomb of frustration. Crew members began quitting. The makeup artist suffered panic attacks. One day, Carrey simply didn't show up. When he returned, he greeted Ron with a grin that wasn't entirely sane. "You still think you're in charge, Opie?" he said, referencing Ron's childhood acting days. The joke stung more than Ron would admit. Howard had always believed that a director's job was to protect his actors, to guide, not to dominate. But Carrey turned that philosophy against him. Every compromise made the set more fragile. Each concession allowed Carrey's chaos to grow until even Ron's famously calm demeanor began to crack. Still, he endured. "Let him run," he told the producers. "If we can capture just one of those wild moments, it'll be worth it." But when the wild moments became the rule rather than the exception, Ron realized he was no longer directing a movie, he was documenting a breakdown disguised as performance. Behind the scenes, he reached out to Carrey quietly. He arranged meditation sessions, longer breaks, even therapy support. It didn't help. Carrey was living inside the mask, literally and emotionally. He once told a crew member, "When the makeup comes off, I don't know who's left underneath." That line haunted Ron, because for all his frustration, he saw the pain behind the madness, a man who had turned performance into self-defense. Yet the cost of empathy was enormous. Every day on set drained the life from him. The film wrapped 2 weeks late. When it was over, Ron didn't attend the final wrap party. He went home, sat in his car for nearly an hour, and whispered, "Never again." The movie became a hit. Jim Carrey was praised for his transformative performance, and critics celebrated the film's manic energy, unaware that much of it came from real exhaustion. Ron said little in interviews. When asked about working with Carrey, he gave a tight smile and said, "He was brilliant, completely unpredictable. And that's both his gift and his curse." Years later, Carrey would call the shoot the most difficult time of my life. Ron never responded publicly. But when asked privately who had tested him the most as a director, his answer was simple. "The Grinch didn't steal Christmas. He stole my peace." Michael Keaton, The Project That Died. It was supposed to be a comeback, not for Michael Keaton, but for Ron Howard. The late 1,990 seconds had left him weary of franchises and studio demands. He wanted something smaller, intimate, a film about failure and redemption. The script was called The Paperman, and Keaton was his first and only choice. They had history. Years earlier, Keaton had worked with Ron on Night Shift, one of the director's earliest successes. Their chemistry was effortless. Ron's .com precision balancing Keaton's wild intelligence. "You gave me my start," Keaton once said to him. "Whatever you do next, I am in." Those words stayed with Ron for years. When The Paperman came together, Keaton signed on immediately. The project had no explosions, no studio interference, just a story about a broken journalist in a dying industry. It was the kind of film Ron loved most: quiet, human, flawed. But within weeks, something changed. Keaton began rewriting lines. He questioned the tone. "It's too soft," he said during one rehearsal. "If you want truth, you have to let it bleed." Ron disagreed. He believed in restraint, the idea that silence could say more than anger ever could. Keaton wanted rage. Ron wanted reflection. Their philosophies collided like flint and steel. By the second month of pre-production, the tension was visible. Keaton grew distant, taking calls from another studio between meetings. Ron sensed the shift but refused to confront it. He still trusted the bond they'd built years earlier. Until one morning, the call came. Keaton was out. No explanation. No meeting. Just a brief message through his agent: creative differences. Ron read those two words over and over, as if trying to decode them. Creative differences. To him, it sounded like a polite way of saying betrayal. He had built the film around Keaton's face, his rhythm, his silence. Without him, there was no movie. Universal tried to salvage the project, offering replacements. Ron refused. It was his story, he said. Without him, it doesn't breathe. Weeks later, The Paperman was shelved. Years of preparation vanished into a single line in a trade magazine. Ron Howard project quietly canceled. When they crossed paths again years later, Keaton smiled like nothing had happened. "Still friends?" he asked. Ron nodded, but inside, something had cracked. He couldn't bring himself to ask why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of hearing the truth, that loyalty in Hollywood was just another temporary contract. Keaton went on to revive his career with Birdman, a film eerily similar to what The Paperman could have been, a washed-up man confronting his own irrelevance. Watching it, Ron felt a strange admiration mixed with regret. He made the film "I couldn't," he whispered to a friend. In interviews, Ron was asked about The Paperman. He always answered the same way. Some stories aren't meant to be told, and some friendships don't survive the telling. Behind the calm, there was bitterness, not loud, not cruel, but enduring. It wasn't hate for Michael Keaton, the actor. It was grief for the film that died the day Keaton walked away. Hollywood forgets easily, but directors remember the ghosts of unfinished stories. For Ron Howard, Michael Keaton became that ghost, the one that never stopped haunting him. Eddie Murphy, the clash of control. Ron Howard had always admired Eddie Murphy's charisma. To him, Murphy represented pure instinct, a performer who could electrify a room before saying a word. When Universal approached Ron in the late 90s seconds about a comedy collaboration, it sounded like a dream pairing: the calm craftsman and the comic hurricane. The project was tentatively titled The Professor's Wife, a character-driven satire about fame, identity, and redemption. But dreams in Hollywood often collapse under the weight of ego. From the first meeting, Ron sensed it, the tension between method and impulse. Murphy showed up late, cracking jokes about Opie, the director, and dismissed storyboards as training wheels. Ron smiled politely, trying to bridge the gap. Comedy, he told Murphy, needs structure. Murphy leaned back in his chair and replied, "No. Comedy is chaos." That single line defined everything that followed. On set, the two men could not have been more different. Ron wanted rehearsals, Murphy refused. Ron believed in repetition to find emotional rhythm. Murphy believed in explosion, doing it once. Fast. Before it cooled. Each take became a battle of patience versus instinct. "You don't tell Miles Davis how to play jazz," Murphy said during one heated exchange. Ron's reply was quiet but sharp. "You don't record jazz without a microphone." The crew began to take sides. Some found Murphy's unpredictability thrilling. Others saw it as sabotage. What Ron saw was a slow unraveling of the film's soul. The jokes grew meaner. The improvisations wilder. Every edit turned into a negotiation between chaos and coherence. At one point, Murphy improvised an entire 10-minute monologue mocking Hollywood directors who pretend they're artists when they're just traffic cops. The laughter on set was nervous, forced. Ron said nothing. He knew the jab was aimed at him. Later that night, he told the assistant director, he doesn't want a director. He wants a mirror. Tensions finally broke during a marketing shoot. Murphy ignored the scheduled plan, improvising insults about studio executives. When Ron tried to stop him, Murphy turned and said, "Man, you're too nice for this business. You direct like you're afraid someone might cry." It wasn't shouted, it was worse. It was said with pity. Ron never forgot that sentence. "You direct like you're afraid." It echoed through his head for months after the project was quietly shut down. Universal blamed creative differences. The same phrase that had haunted him since the Keaton fallout. The footage was locked away. Neither man mentioned it again. Years later, when asked if he would ever consider working with Murphy again, Ron replied, "Eddie's a genius. No question. But genius needs oxygen and I breathe order." That was his gentlest way of saying never again. Behind the diplomatic tone lay the truth. Murphy represented everything Ron both admired and feared: talent without restraint, charisma without consequence. And perhaps that was why the clash hurt so deeply. Murphy reminded him of something he could never be: unpredictable, raw, dangerous. For Ron Howard, control wasn't just a directing style, it was survival. And Eddie Murphy was the storm that refused to be contained. Hugh Laurie, The Gentleman Feud. On paper, The Dilemma, 2011, should have been one of Ron Howard's easiest projects, a light drama about friendship and betrayal. But behind its polished humor was a storm disguised as civility. At the center of it stood Hugh Laurie, the British intellect. Razor sharp, reserved, a man who dissected scripts the way a surgeon dissects truth. Ron admired him instantly. He had always been drawn to performers who could balance wit with emotional precision. But what began as mutual respect soon turned into something colder, quieter, a silent war of philosophies. Laurie joined the cast late, replacing another actor who had backed out. From the start, he challenged everything. "This line doesn't feel honest," he would say. "Why would this man do that?" It wasn't rebellion, it was intellect turned into weapon. Ron, patient as ever, tried to adjust. "Let's find a version that feels true," Head reply. But each rewrite pulled the film further from what Head envisioned. Laurie believed the movie should have been darker, more morally ambiguous, a study of guilt, not comedy. Ron wanted warmth, forgiveness, redemption. To him, movies were about healing. To Laurie, they were about exposure. "You want comfort?" Laurie told him during one tense evening on set. "But comfort is the death of honesty." Ron stared back, calm but wounded. "And honesty," he said, "without mercy, becomes cruelty." That was the moment everything changed. From then on, their collaboration turned into choreography, two men dancing around respect and resentment. On set, their exchanges became clipped, technical. Between takes, they stood at opposite ends of the stage, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than shouting. The crew called it the duel in whispers. When filming wrapped, Laurie sent a handwritten note, "Thank you for your patience, even when I mistook it for weakness." Ron kept the letter, unread for months. He knew the compliment hit a cut. In interviews, he praised Laurie's intelligence, calling him a master of nuance. Privately, he admitted to a friend, "He's brilliant, but he made me feel small. Like I wasn't directing a film, I was defending it." The film's release did little to mend the fracture. The Dilemma received lukewarm reviews. Critics said it lacked identity, too serious to be funny, too polite to be profound. Ron carried the weight of that criticism quietly, but he knew where it came from, two men pulling in opposite directions until the story split in half. Laurie moved on to more complex roles. Ron returned to safer ground. They never spoke again. Years later, in a rare interview, Laurie was asked about working with Howard. He paused, smiled faintly, and said, "He's the kindest man I've met in Hollywood," which is exactly why it was so difficult. Ron read that line once, then closed the magazine. He didn't hate Hugh Laurie as a man. He hated what Laurie forced him to confront, that kindness. In the world of art, can look like fear. For someone who had built a career on harmony, Laurie was the crack in the mirror, the proof that even the gentlest men have limits. And perhaps that's why this feud, quiet and dignified, hurt the most. It wasn't a storm. It was the slow erosion of belief that decency could survive in the company of brilliance. 6 names, 6 storms, and not one truly forgiven. To the world, Ron Howard remains the gentle architect of Hollywood's most hopeful stories, the man who made kindness a brand, the smiling proof that decency could still thrive in an industry built on vanity. But behind that calm exterior lived a quieter truth that even the kindest souls carry private wars. Each name on his unspoken list marked a wound not of rage, but of disappointment. Tom Hanks, the friend who outshined him. Russell Crowe, the ego he could never tame. Jim Carrey, the chaos he couldn't control. Michael Keaton, the betrayal that killed a dream. Eddie Murphy, the storm of defiance. Hugh Laurie, the gentleman who made him doubt his own gentleness. He never raised his voice. He never sought revenge. He simply retreated into silence, into work, into the illusion of peace. And maybe that's the final irony of Ron Howard's life. The man who built entire worlds out of harmony was shaped, in truth, by conflict, because hate, for men like him, isn't loud. It doesn't burn. It lingers soft, invisible, and eternal.